It was a crisp Monday morning when Andrea Reynolds walked into the 34th precinct, her observant eyes taking in every detail of what would soon be her new workplace. After 2 decades of breaking barriers and solving cases across 3 different states, she had earned this position through sheer determination and excellence. But today, she chose to arrive without the fanfare, wearing a simple navy blazer and black slacks, blending in like any other civilian. The precinct buzzed with typical morning activity. Phones ringing, officers shuffling papers, and the unmistakable scent of day-old coffee lingering in the air. Andrea stood quietly in the lobby, watching the morning unfold like a carefully orchestrated dance. Officers rushed past her, some nodding politely, others barely noticing her presence. She noticed the worn-out chairs, the outdated community bulletins, and the clear divide between the officers and the civilians waiting to file reports. Officers Brian Cooper and David Wilson were having their usual morning chat near the water cooler, their voices carrying across the lobby. As Andrea adjusted her shoulder bag, their attention turned to her. "Look what we've got here," Cooper muttered to Wilson, just loud enough for others to hear. "Bet she's here to complain about her neighbor's dog again." Wilson chuckled, taking a long sip from his coffee cup. Andrea could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up, making assumptions. She'd seen that look countless times before, the quick dismissal, the casual disregard. But 20 years in law enforcement had taught her patience. She watched as they continued their commentary, noting how other officers nearby either smirked or looked away uncomfortably. A young officer, Lisa Chen, stood at her desk, clearly bothered by her colleague's behavior. She kept glancing between her computer screen and the scene unfolding before her, her discomfort visible in the way she shuffled papers unnecessarily on her desk. As Andrea walked towards the front desk, she overheard Cooper say, $10 says she's lost. Should we help her find her way?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Wilson played along, adding, "Maybe she's looking for the complaints department. You know how these people love to file complaints." The front desk officer, caught between professionalism and peer pressure, gave Andrea a strained smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of the precinct's apparent culture. Andrea smiled back, warm and professional. "Yes, I'm looking for the administrative office, please." The question was simple, but it set off another round of poorly concealed snickers from Cooper and Wilson. Behind her, Andrea could hear them continuing their commentary, growing bolder with each passing moment. Other officers began gathering around them, some uncomfortably shifting their weight from foot to foot, others joining in with subtle nods and smirks. The lobby had become a stage, and Andrea was unwittingly playing the lead role in their morning entertainment. Lisa Chen finally stood up from her desk, apparently having had enough. But before she could intervene, Andrea caught her eye and gave her a subtle shake of the head. The young officer hesitated, then slowly sat back down, confusion evident on her face. As Andrea received directions to the administrative office, deliberately confusing ones, she noted, she maintained her composure, thanking the desk officer politely. Walking away, she could hear Cooper and Wilson's laughter following her down the hallway. Little did they know, in just a few hours, this supposedly lost civilian would be standing before them as their new chief of police, ready to reshape the very culture they so proudly displayed. The morning light streaming through the precinct windows cast long shadows across the floor, much like the shadows of change that were about to sweep through the 34th precinct. Andrea clutched her bag a little tighter, knowing that the real work was about to begin. Following the confusing directions she'd been given, Andrea made her way through the maze-like hallways of the 34th precinct. The walls were lined with faded photographs of past police chiefs, all white men with stern expressions. She noticed there wasn't a single woman or person of color among them. Soon, that would change. As she turned a corner, she nearly bumped into Officer Cooper, who had apparently decided to follow her. "Oh, look who's wandering around," he said, making no effort to hide his amusement. Lost already. Behind him, Officer Wilson appeared, coffee cup still in hand. Maybe we should escort her out before she gets into any restricted areas, he suggested, loud enough for nearby officers to hear. Andrea straightened her blazer and looked directly at them. Actually, I was looking for the break room. Would you mind pointing me in the right direction? Her polite request seemed to fuel their entertainment further. Cooper crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. Break room. This isn't a public coffee shop, ma'am. This is a police station. A small crowd of officers had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed amused, but none stepped forward to help. Lisa Chen, the young officer from earlier, watched from around the corner, her hand nervously playing with her badge. "I'm well aware this is a police station," Andrea replied calmly. "I simply asked for directions." Her composed response appeared to irritate Cooper, who exchanged a look with Wilson. "Well, since you're so interested in our break room," Wilson said, "it's down that hallway. Take 3 lefts, 2 rights, and it's the door marked Maintenance." Several officers snickered, knowing full well those directions would lead to a storage closet. Andrea nodded, thanking them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As she walked away, she could hear Cooper saying, "Watch, she'll be back in 5 minutes," completely turned around. The laughter that followed echoed through the hallway. Instead of following their misleading directions, Andrea made her way to the actual break room. She had memorized the precinct layout weeks ago. Walking in, she found several officers huddled around a small TV mounted on the wall. They fell silent as she entered, their conversations dropping to whispers. She approached the coffee machine, feeling their eyes on her back. One officer, a veteran named Thompson, loudly asked his colleague, "Since when did this become a public coffee shop?" The question was met with a few nervous laughs. Andrea calmly poured herself a cup, added cream and sugar, and took a deliberate sip. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. A young rookie officer quickly gathered his things and left, unable to handle the uncomfortable atmosphere. Andrea noticed how some officers avoided making eye contact with her, while others stared challengingly. Cooper and Wilson appeared in the doorway, seemingly surprised to find her there. "Well, would you look at that?" Cooper announced. "She found her way after all." Wilson added with a smirk, "Maybe she's got a future in law enforcement after all. As a dispatcher, maybe." Andrea checked her watch. Just 2 hours until a department-wide meeting. She had seen and heard enough to understand exactly what kind of changes were needed in this precinct. The casual discrimination, the pack mentality, the silent enablers, it was all going to change. As she walked out of the break room, coffee in hand, she heard Wilson say, "Don't worry, folks. I'm sure she'll file a complaint about us before she leaves." Little did they know, she wouldn't be filing a complaint. She'd be filing performance reviews. The thought almost made her smile as she headed toward the administrative office, where the current chief was waiting to brief her before the big announcement. Lisa Chen watched Andrea walk past her desk again, this time with more purpose in her stride. The young officer seemed to sense something was different about this visitor, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. In just a few hours, she, along with everyone else in the precinct, would understand exactly why. After leaving the break room, Andrea walked through different departments of the precinct, taking mental notes of everything she saw. The detective division was buzzing with activity, but she noticed how the only 2 female detectives were assigned to cold cases, while their male colleagues handled the high-profile investigations. She passed by the dispatch center, where a heated argument was taking place. "I don't care if she's been waiting for 3 hours," one of the officers was saying to a worried dispatcher. "That neighborhood always calls for nothing." Andrea paused, pretending to look at a bulletin board while listening. The dispatcher, an older woman with graying hair, tried to argue back but was quickly shut down. In the evidence room, Andrea encountered more of the same attitude when she asked to see the booking procedures. The sergeant in charge barely looked up from his computer. "Public records requests need to be filed downtown," he muttered, waving her away. When she didn't move, he finally looked up, irritation clear on his face. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You need to leave." Officer Cooper appeared again, seemingly everywhere today. "Having trouble with our guest, Sarge?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. The sergeant sighed heavily. "Just another civilian who doesn't understand how things work around here." Cooper stepped forward, placing himself between Andrea and the evidence room. "Let me handle this, Sarge. I'll make sure she finds her way out." As they walked down the hallway, Cooper couldn't resist adding to his morning's performance. "You know," he said, loud enough for others to hear, "most people would have taken the hint by now." A few officers nearby chuckled, but Andrea noticed Lisa Chen quickly turning away, embarrassment clear on her face. Wilson joined them, right on cue. "Still here?" he asked, feigning surprise. "You must really like our hospitality." The two officers shared a laugh, clearly enjoying their little power play. Andrea remained silent, observing how other staff members reacted to their behavior. Some seemed uncomfortable, others indifferent, but no one spoke up. She made her way to the community outreach office, finding it almost empty except for a few dusty brochures. The bulletin board displayed outdated community meeting notices from 6 months ago. When she asked about current programs, the clerk simply shrugged. "Budget cuts," he explained, not bothering to look up from his phone. "Besides, those people never show up anyway." Back in the main hallway, Andrea overheard Wilson talking to a group of younger officers. "See, that's the problem these days," he was saying. "Everyone thinks they can just walk in here and tell us how to do our jobs." The rookies nodded along, already being molded into the precinct's toxic culture. Cooper spotted her again and nudged Wilson. "Look who's still on our tour," he announced. "Maybe we should show her the holding cells next." Their laughter echoed through the hallway, but this time, Andrea noticed something different. Lisa Chen had finally had enough. "Don't you guys have actual work to do?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking slightly but determined. Cooper and Wilson turned to her, surprised by the challenge. "Excuse me?" Cooper asked, his tone dropping dangerously low. Before Lisa could respond, Andrea stepped in. "Actually," she said calmly, checking her watch, "don't you all have a department meeting to attend?" The mention of the meeting caused a stir. Officers began checking their watches and phones, suddenly remembering the mandatory gathering scheduled for 11 a.m. As everyone started moving toward the conference room, Andrea noticed how Cooper and Wilson lagged behind, still chuckling about their morning entertainment. Lisa tried to catch her eye, but Andrea was already heading toward the administrative office. She had one last brief meeting with the outgoing chief before everything would change. The morning had shown her exactly what she needed to know about the 34th Precinct. The discrimination wasn't just about race or gender. It was deeply embedded in every aspect of their operation. But in less than 30 minutes, Officer Cooper and Wilson's comfortable world was about to be turned upside down. The conference room filled up quickly as officers filed in for the mandatory department meeting. Cooper and Wilson, still riding high from their morning's entertainment, grabbed seats in the front row. They were busy retelling their stories to anyone who would listen, earning a few laughs and several uncomfortable glances. "Man, you should have seen her face when we sent her to the storage closet," Cooper was saying, not bothering to keep his voice down. Wilson added, "Yeah, bet she's still wandering around somewhere." Their laughter died down as the outgoing Chief Richards walked to the podium, his expression unusually serious. The room fell silent as Chief Richards cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone. As you know, after 30 years of service, I'm retiring next week." He paused, looking around the room. "Today, I have the honor of introducing your new chief of police." Cooper leaned over to Wilson, whispering loud enough for nearby officers to hear, "Bet it's that guy from the 52nd. Wilson nodded. Yeah, heard he's tough but fair. They settled back in their chairs, confident in their assumptions. Chief Richards continued, Your new chief brings 20 years of experience, with an impressive record of reducing crime rates and improving community relations in 3 different cities. He gestured toward the side door. Please welcome your new chief of police. The door opened, and Andrea walked in. But she wasn't wearing civilian clothes anymore. She was dressed in full uniform, her chief stars gleaming on her collar, rows of commendation medals decorating her chest. The room fell into stunned silence. Cooper's coffee cup slipped from his hand, spilling across the floor. Wilson's face turned pale, his mouth hanging open. Neither of them moved to clean up the spilled coffee. Behind them, several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others sat up straighter, suddenly very alert. Lisa Chen, sitting in the back, couldn't hide her smile. A few other officers were desperately trying to remember if they had interacted with Andrea that morning, and if so, how they had treated her. Chief Richards stepped aside, and Andrea took her place at the podium. Her eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on Cooper and Wilson, who seemed to be trying to sink into their chairs. Good morning, she said, her voice clear and confident. I believe some of you have already shown me around the precinct this morning. The silence in the room was deafening. Someone in the back coughed nervously. Cooper and Wilson stared straight ahead, their faces a mix of shock and horror as they realized all their jokes and comments had been heard by their new boss. I've spent the morning observing this precinct, Andrea continued. I've seen how you treat each other, how you treat civilians, and how you approach your duties. She paused, letting her words sink in. I've seen exactly what needs to change. Several officers glanced at Cooper and Wilson, who had gone from being the morning's entertainment to the precinct's cautionary tale in a matter of seconds. Lisa Chen sat up straighter, hope visible on her face as she watched her new chief command the room. Starting today, Andrea announced, things will be different at the 34th Precinct. Merit will matter more than seniority. Respect will be non-negotiable. And discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated. Her eyes met Cooper's, then Wilson's. Some of you have already given me a very clear demonstration of what needs to change. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officers who had laughed at Cooper and Wilson's jokes earlier were now studying their shoes intently. Those who had stayed silent during the morning's events were wondering if their silence made them equally guilty. Andrea spread her hands on the podium, leaning forward slightly. I believe in second chances, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. But I also believe in accountability. Those who aren't ready to embrace change might want to consider other career options. As her words settled over the room, Cooper and Wilson exchanged glances, finally understanding the full impact of their morning's behavior. Their comfortable world had indeed been turned upside down, and this was only the beginning. After the meeting, the conference room emptied slowly. Officers filed out in unusual silence, the normal chatter and jokes notably absent. Cooper and Wilson remained frozen in their seats, unable to move as their colleagues walked past them. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others shot them disapproving looks. Chief Andrea stayed at the podium, organizing her papers with deliberate calm. She could hear the whispers, see the sideways glances, feel the shift in the room's dynamics. The same officers who had laughed at her hours ago now stood straighter as they passed by, mumbling "Chief" with newfound respect. Lisa Chen lingered near the door, clearly wanting to speak but unsure if she should. Finally, gathering her courage, she approached the podium. Chief, she started, her voice quiet but steady. I wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner this morning. Andrea looked up from her papers, studying the young officer's face. Sometimes, she replied, knowing when to speak up is just as important as knowing what to say. Lisa nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the chief's words. Meanwhile, Cooper and Wilson finally stood up, looking like they'd aged 10 years in the past hour. They awkwardly made their way toward the door, trying to slip out unnoticed. "Officers," Andrea called out, her voice stopping them in their tracks. "My office, 15 minutes." The hallways buzzed with excited whispers as word spread throughout the precinct. The same officers who had ignored or mocked her that morning now scrambled to look busy as she walked past. The evidence room surgeon, who had dismissed her earlier, was suddenly very interested in updating his booking procedures. In the break room, a group of officers huddled around the coffee machine, their conversation dropping to whispers as she entered. She could hear fragments of their discussion. "Did you see Cooper's face? Wilson looked like he was going to pass out. Can't believe they spent all morning." Andrea poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, noting how everyone stepped aside to let her use the machine first. The same coffee maker that had been the scene of mockery just hours ago now felt like the center of a different kind of tension. Back in her new office, Andrea sat behind the desk, looking at the wall of past chiefs' photos. Soon, her picture would join them, the first woman, the first person of color. But she knew the real change wouldn't come from breaking that barrier. It would come from what she did next. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Cooper and Wilson stood in the doorway, looking like schoolboys sent to the principal's office. "Come in," she said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. They sat down, neither making eye contact. "So," she began, her voice calm but firm, "let's talk about this morning's tour of the precinct." Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Wilson stared at his hands. The confidence and arrogance they had displayed earlier had completely vanished. "Chief, Cooper started, but Andrea held up her hand. "I'm not interested in apologies right now," she said. "I'm interested in actions. You both have choices to make." She opened a folder on her desk, pulling out 2 sets of papers. "Option 1. Transfer requests to any precinct that will take you." She slid 1 set of papers across the desk. "Option 2. Stay here, under my command, and prove you can be part of the change this precinct needs." She placed the second set of papers next to the first. The silence in the room was heavy as both officers stared at the papers in front of them. Outside the office, life at the 34th precinct continued, but everyone knew things would never be quite the same. The old guard was facing a choice: adapt or leave. Through the office window, Andrea could see Lisa Chen at her desk, sitting a little straighter, working with renewed purpose. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like a morning of misguided mockery that turned into a lesson no one at the 34th precinct would ever forget. 2 weeks had passed since Chief Andrea's dramatic revelation, and the 34th precinct was going through major changes. The morning briefing room, once filled with casual jokes and snide comments, now had a different atmosphere. Officers sat up straight, paid attention, and took notes as Andrea outlined new community engagement initiatives. "Starting next week, we're launching our neighborhood outreach program," she announced, pointing to a map of the district. "Every officer will spend time walking their beat, getting to know the residents, building trust." Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded with interest. Cooper, who had chosen to stay at the precinct, sat quietly in the back row. The past 2 weeks had been eye-opening for him. After that first meeting in the chief's office, he'd been assigned to work with community leaders in the areas he once dismissed. Now, he found himself learning names, hearing stories, and slowly understanding what real police work meant. Wilson had taken a different path, submitting his transfer request the very next day. As he cleared out his desk, the other officers watched in silence, some wondering if they should have done more to stop his behavior, others questioning their own attitudes. Lisa Chen had been promoted to lead the new community relations unit. She stood beside Chief Andrea, explaining the latest program to help at-risk youth. The same officers who once ignored her ideas now listened attentively, taking notes and asking questions. After the briefing, Andrea walked through the precinct, noting the changes. The break room bulletin board, once covered in outdated notices, now displayed current community events and success stories. The dispatch center had new protocols ensuring equal response times to all neighborhoods. She passed by the evidence room, where the surgeon who had dismissed her now jumped to attention. "Chief," he said, "I've updated all our booking procedures like you requested. Would you like to review them?" His eagerness to prove himself almost made her smile. In the detective division, the changes were even more apparent. The two female detectives who had been stuck with cold cases were now leading major investigations. Their male colleagues, initially resistant, had started coming to them for advice and collaboration. Cooper approached her in the hallway, looking nervous but determined. "Chief," he said, "I've been thinking about what happened in the Thompson case last week." He explained how an elderly resident had helped them solve a string of burglaries, someone they might have ignored in the past. "Maybe we've been looking at community policing all wrong," he admitted. The afternoon brought a sensitivity training session, mandatory for all officers. The room was packed as a community leader spoke about her experiences with law enforcement. Andrea watched as officers who once rolled their eyes at such sessions now leaned forward, engaged in the discussion. "Remember," the speaker said, "every person who walks through those precinct doors has a story, has dignity, deserves respect." Andrea noticed Cooper nodding, his expression thoughtful. The morning's jokes seemed like a lifetime ago. Later in her office, Andrea reviewed the latest community feedback reports. Complaints were down, while positive interactions were up. The changes weren't just on paper. They were happening on the streets, in the daily interactions between officers and residents. Lisa knocked on her door with more good news. The youth basketball program they started had doubled in size. "The kids actually wave at our patrol cars now," she reported, her face beaming with pride. "And Officer Cooper, you should see him with the younger ones. He's like a different person." As the day wound down, Andrea stood at her office window, watching the shift change. Officers heading out greeted community members by name, while those coming in carried notes from neighborhood meetings. The precinct that had once been a symbol of division was slowly becoming a model of change. She noticed Cooper staying late, working on something at his desk. When she passed by, she saw him creating flyers for the upcoming community fair, something the old Cooper would have mocked. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest skeptics could become the strongest advocates if given the chance to change. 3 months into Chief Andrea's leadership, the real transformation of the 34th Precinct began to show. Officer Cooper stood in front of the local community center, surrounded by a group of teenage basketball players. "Great game, everyone," he called out, giving high fives to the kids as they headed home. A nearby resident, Mrs. Thompson, waved to him from her porch. 6 months ago, he would have ignored her. Now he walked over to chat. "How's that new security light working out?" he asked, remembering how he'd helped install it last week after she reported suspicious activity. "Makes me feel much safer," she smiled, offering him a glass of lemonade. As they talked, Cooper noticed other neighbors joining their conversation. These were the same streets he used to patrol with dread, the same people he once dismissed. Now he knew their names, their stories, their concerns. Back at the precinct, Chief Andrea was reviewing the monthly statistics with Lisa. Crime rates were down, but more importantly, community trust was up. The anonymous tip line, once silent, now rang regularly with residents helping solve cases. "Look at these numbers," Lisa said excitedly, pointing to a chart. "Complaints against officers are down 60%, and our community meeting attendance has tripled." She paused, then added with a smile, "And Cooper's youth program is becoming a model for other precincts." The mention of Cooper made Andrea think about how far he'd come. That morning, she'd overheard him correcting a rookie officer who made a dismissive comment about a resident. "That's not how we do things here anymore," he'd said firmly. "Every person deserves respect." Later that afternoon, the precinct hosted a community advisory board meeting. The conference room, once a place of tension, was now filled with animated discussions between officers and residents. Cooper sat next to Mrs. Thompson, taking notes as she described her neighborhood's concerns. "Remember when we used to avoid these meetings?" One veteran officer whispered to another. "Now I actually look forward to them." His colleague nodded, adding, "Yeah, turns out the community had good ideas all along. We just weren't listening." After the meeting, Andrea found Cooper organizing a follow-up action plan. "Chief," he said, looking slightly embarrassed, "about that first day, I never properly apologized." She watched him struggle with the words. "I was wrong. Not just about you, but about everything." Before she could respond, a call came in about a situation at the local high school. Cooper grabbed his keys, but instead of rushing out alone, he turned to Lisa. "Want to handle this one together? Your community approach might be better here." As they left, Andrea noticed how naturally they worked together now. The same officers who once competed and undermined each other were now collaborating, sharing knowledge, supporting each other's strengths. The evening shift brought more signs of change. The dispatch center handled calls with new sensitivity. Officers responded with respect regardless of the neighborhood, and the holding cells, once a place of harsh judgment, saw officers treating everyone with dignity. Walking through the precinct, Andrea overheard snippets of conversation that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. Officers discussing cultural awareness, planning community events, sharing success stories about resolution instead of arrests. In the break room, she found Cooper making coffee for the night shift. The same coffee machine that had been the scene of mockery on her first day now served as a gathering place for officers and community members alike. "You know," Cooper said, handing her a cup, "I almost transferred out that first day. Would have been the biggest mistake of my career." He looked around the break room, now decorated with community thank you cards and photos from neighborhood events. "I needed that wake-up call." As the night shift began, Andrea watched from her office as Cooper headed out on patrol. Through the window, she could see him stop to help an elderly resident with groceries, the kind of simple, human interaction that once seemed beneath him. Sometimes, she thought, the best changes happen not through force, but through example. 6 months had passed, and the 34th Precinct had become almost unrecognizable from its former self. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Chief Andrea reviewed a stack of letters on her desk. Not complaints, but thank you notes from community members. A knock on her door revealed Cooper, looking more confident than ever in his role. "Chief, you need to see this," he said, holding up a local newspaper. The headline read, "34th Precinct, a model of police reform." The article praised the precinct's transformation and highlighted their community programs. Lisa rushed in behind him, barely containing her excitement. "Chief, we just got the latest survey results. Community trust is at an all-time high, and our programs are being copied by precincts across the state." She spread the papers across Andrea's desk, pointing out the impressive statistics. Down in the lobby, the scene was dramatically different from that first morning 6 months ago. Officers greeted visitors warmly, taking time to listen to their concerns. The old, worn-out chairs had been replaced with comfortable seating, and the walls displayed colorful artwork from local school children. Cooper was scheduled to give a presentation to new recruits about community policing. As he sat up in the conference room, he caught his reflection in the window. The arrogant officer who had mocked his chief that first day seemed like a stranger now. "The most important thing to remember," he told the attentive recruits, "is that a badge doesn't make you superior. It makes you responsible." He shared stories about how building trust had helped solve more crimes than any show of force ever had. During lunch, Andrea walked through the neighborhood surrounding the precinct. Shopkeepers waved, children called out greetings, and elderly residents stopped to chat. These simple interactions would have been impossible 6 months ago, when fear and distrust ruled the streets. Back at the precinct, she found Lisa mediating a dispute between two residents. Instead of immediately writing citations or making arrests, she listened patiently, helped them find common ground, and worked out a solution that satisfied everyone. "Remember when we thought this kind of policing was a waste of time?" Cooper asked, watching the scene. "Now we solve more cases through conversation than confrontation." He shook his head, amazed at his own transformation. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Wilson, who had transferred out months ago. He stood awkwardly in the lobby, taking in the changes. The community bulletin board now overflowed with event flyers and success stories. The same halls that once echoed with mockery now buzzed with purposeful activity. "This place is different," Wilson muttered, watching officers and residents interact easily. Cooper approached his former partner, noting how uncomfortable Wilson looked in this new environment. "We're different," Cooper corrected him. "We finally learned what real police work is about." Late afternoon found Andrea reviewing body camera footage with a group of officers. Instead of looking for violations, they were identifying positive interactions to use in training. "See how Officer Chen de-escalated that situation," she pointed out. "That's the standard we aim for now." The day wound down with a community safety meeting. The same conference room where Andrea had revealed her identity now hosted a diverse group of officers and residents, working together to make their neighborhood better. Cooper sat next to Mrs. Thompson, the elderly resident he once would have ignored, taking detailed notes about her concerns. As night fell, Andrea watched the shift change from her office window. Officers ending their shifts shared information with their replacements, not just about crimes and suspects, but about community members who might need checking on, about ongoing neighborhood initiatives, about the human side of policing. Cooper stayed late again, this time organizing a weekend cleanup project with local teenagers. "You know," he said when Andrea passed by his desk, "I used to think respect had to be demanded. Now I understand it has to be earned." He looked at the photo wall, where images of community events had replaced the stern portraits of past chiefs. "This is the kind of legacy I want to leave." 1 year had passed since that memorable morning when a new chief walked into the 34th precinct. The anniversary celebration filled the community center with officers, residents, and local leaders. The walls displayed photos chronicling the precinct's transformation, including a particularly telling before and after shot of the precinct lobby. Chief Andrea stood at the podium, looking out at the mixed crowd. Gone were the invisible barriers that once separated police from the community. Officers and residents sat together, chatting like old friends. In the front row, Cooper sat beside Mrs. Thompson, both wearing t-shirts from the latest community cleanup event. "A year ago," Andrea began, "I walked into this precinct as a civilian. What I saw that day showed me exactly what needed to change." She paused, meeting Cooper's eyes. He nodded slightly, acknowledging how far they'd come. "But what I've seen this past year has shown me what's possible when people choose to change." Lisa stepped forward to present the year's achievements. Crime rates had dropped by 40%, community participation had increased tenfold, and their programs were being studied by police departments across the country. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story," she said, gesturing to the crowd. "The real change is in this room." A local teenager stood up to share how Cooper's youth program had changed his life. "Last year, I was afraid of police officers," he admitted. "Now I want to become one." Cooper blinked back tears, remembering how he once would have dismissed this same kid as trouble. The celebration included a surprise video montage of the year's highlights. Cooper playing basketball with local kids, Lisa mediating community disputes, officers helping elderly residents, neighborhood block parties, and countless small moments of connection and respect. Mrs. Thompson took the microphone to share her perspective. "A year ago, we wouldn't call the police unless it was life or death," she said. "Now they're part of our community. Officer Cooper even helps me with my grocery shopping." The crowd laughed warmly, but everyone understood the significance of this simple change. As if on cue, a call came in about a situation at the local high school. Cooper and Lisa responded together, but this time they weren't alone. Community members offered to help, showing how the boundary between police and public had dissolved. Back at the celebration, Andrea unveiled plans for the coming year: more youth programs, expanded community partnerships, and a mentoring system for new officers. The same officers who once resisted change now eagerly volunteered to lead these initiatives. A news crew arrived to document the precinct's success story. They interviewed Cooper about his remarkable transformation. "I was that officer," he admitted openly. "The one who judged people without knowing them. The one who thought power was more important than service. I'm not proud of who I was, but I'm grateful for the wake-up call that helped me change." As the evening wound down, Andrea found herself back in the precinct lobby where it all began. The space had been transformed, but the real change was in the people. Officers ending their shifts stopped to chat with community members, sharing stories and making plans for upcoming events. Wilson made a surprise appearance, looking different somehow. "I was wrong to leave," he said quietly. "I've requested a transfer back, if you'll have me." Andrea smiled, noting how he engaged respectfully with everyone around him. People could change if given the chance. The day ended with a community dinner in the precinct parking lot. Officers and residents shared meals and stories. Children played safely under the watchful eyes of the whole community, and the barriers that once seemed insurmountable had vanished. As the sun set on the anniversary celebration, Andrea watched Cooper teaching a group of rookies. "Remember," he told them, "our job isn't about power. It's about service. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, regardless of who they are or how they look." The rookies absorbed his words, unaware that they were learning from an officer who had once embodied everything they were being taught to avoid. In the end, Andrea thought that was perhaps the most powerful lesson of all: that change was always possible, that it was never too late to learn, and that sometimes the biggest transformations start with a simple moment of realization.